episódios e lugares-chave do experimentalismo nas artes performativas entre a década de 1960 e hoje. A partir de arquivos e de experiências concretas, temos viajado então entre diferentes geografias e tempos, conhecendo e discutindo inovações formais como a suposta primeira black box na Europa, a disseminação da ideia de criação coletiva, o foco na interdisciplinaridade ou no processo em vez de no produto, procurando entendê-las política e esteticamente nos seus contextos de origem e questionando a sua operacionalidade hoje. Since 2019, Histórias do Experimental has been looking at the performing arts from a genealogical, contextual and transnational point of view, understanding aesthetics and politics as deeply intertwined, and inquiring into traveling ideas and practices, questioning dramaturgical contaminations. At stake, there are forms of life more than artistic formats. Performance in an Age of Precariety, de Maddy Costa e Andy Field, que temos o prazer de ter aqui hoje connosco, é uma antologia de ensaios que procura esboçar um mapa da paisagem da performance contemporânea britânica no período entre a crise financeira de 2008 e a pandemia de 2020. Os ensaios focam-se em artistas particulares, entre eles alguns nomes conhecidos do público lisboeta, como Forced Entertainment, Tanya Alcuri, Action Hero, Deborah Pearson e Tim Crouch. Estes ensaios, que podem ser poéticos, autobiográficos, analíticos ou discursivos, aspiram a imaginar um novo vocabulário para falar e pensar sobre a radicalidade da performance ao vivo. Por mapear um momento significativo do experimentalismo contemporâneo, esta conversa integra-se na série Histórias do Experimental do TBA. Por ser sobre um livro, poderia fazer parte das práticas de leitura. E porque vamos falar de artistas e espetáculos com uma das criadoras do Teatro Club, que nos inspirou na criação do nosso clube espectador, não deixa de ser também um encontro com esse nome. Vou passar agora a palavra ao Francisco, que moderará a sessão de hoje e apresentará os autores. No final abriremos para conversa, estando desde já convidados a participar em voz, por chat no Zoom, YouTube ou Facebook. Eu recolherei as questões que lerei alto quando houver oportunidade. Muito obrigada.
Hi, Maddy. Hi, Andy. Welcome and thank you for doing this. This is a talk, a chat, having as a pretext the book that you co-wrote, and that was published recently. And the reason I suggested this to Anna as part of this ongoing series about histories of the experimental has to do, I think, with the feeling that I think a lot of people had when you launched the book in a Zoom meeting as well earlier this year. It was during one of the lockdowns, at least in Portugal. I think we were in lockdown, so theatre was on hold, and there was this sense of something very nostalgic and there was a sort of an elegiac feeling about the whole meeting, and it was very beautiful and very moving and very and sad at the same time. I think that we were all hearing about these works, these shows that we were basically missing, that we're not able to access anymore. And so I think that was a very powerful feeling, and it sort of took this book, which we thought was maybe about the present and what was being done now, and it suddenly became about sort of a time capsule, which I'm sure you'll talk about more. And also, I think as Anna was saying, I think before we started. I think that the issue of writing is really interesting for me and for TBA and for Anna as well. This thing of how do you write about performance, or how do you write in a way that is itself performance perhaps as well. And of course you are two of the theatre writers or the performance writers that I admire the most, and I've known you or I've read you and known you for a while now. I know Andy since because of Forest Fringe in Edinburgh, and Maddy maybe writing about Forest Fringe at the same time was when I first heard about you, and on Twitter and on your blog, and also because of Theatre Club, which I attended once, and which was also an inspiration for our own Clube Espectador, which is an ongoing series of conversations we have at TBA with Maria Sequeira Mendes and Zé Maria Vieira Mendes, also normally without the so post-show talks without the artists, is what we call them normally. And yeah, so it's a joy to be able to be here with you, and to learn from you, basically, and see what you can share with us, and what we can take on our journeys from now on. So maybe I think Andy will start. There will be so Andy will talk, and Maddy will talk, and they will both read excerpts from the book, and we'll be able to share them with you. There's a translation of those excerpts on our website, Teatro do Bairro Alto.pt, and if you're in the Zoom meeting, you can also, I think we can send you the PDF of that. So maybe I'll let Andy and Maddy talk now.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for that lovely introduction. Actually, Francisco played such an important role in the life of Forest Fringe, which is, I suppose, Forest Fringe, the venue I was the co-director of in Edinburgh, that around so much this book orbited around. And we did our first ever international project in Lisbon many years ago now. So Francisco really, by all rights, should be a footnote, at least a significant footnote in this book somewhere. So yes, I'm going to talk for, I hope, approximately 10 minutes about the kind of context that this book came out of, and why Maddy and I chose to write it, and then how we went about that. And then I think Maddy is going to talk for an equivalent amount of time about the approach that we took to writing the book, how we tried to write. So this book really emerged out of a particular cultural scene and a particular moment in time in the UK that Maddy and I were both a part of, and we were a part of in a number of different ways and a number of different roles. The book started as an attempt to document that scene, to map the landscape that we found ourselves a part of, even as parts of that landscape were in the process of disappearing or being remodeled. So as I was trying to write this, I asked myself the question, how do you define a scene? Maddy and I were undoubtedly part of a scene. We felt that, and that's what prompted us to want to write the book. We felt the presence of a scene around us, familiar faces, familiar artists. Part of our friendship in the first place came simply from bumping into each other at venues that we both frequented in the UK, and from, as Francisco said, I think from reading each other's blogs and communicating via email. So we were clearly existing in the same orbit, but what it was that we were orbiting around was sort of harder to define. We knew some of the same artists, we loved some of the same artists, we frequented the same venues and festivals, but like any scene, that scene that we were a part of was not discrete and easily mappable. It didn't have clear edges or a clear beginning or even a clear end, although it did have an ellipses that maybe I'll come on to mention later. The scene, in an attempt to kind of describe it, I thought about this. It was made up of artists and performance work that, and Maddy might violently disagree with this, and so might Francisco, but this was my attempt, that it was a group of artists, an informal community of artists that existed at the intersection of a number of trends in the UK in the sort of early 2000s. The popularity, and those trends, maybe the popularity of a particular kind of physical theatre, informed by things like Lecoq and that kind of French tradition, experimental dance work like Alain Platel and Jerome Bell, the emergence in the 1990s of live art in the UK as a particular category of performance art, both sort of body-based performance art and a set of sort of socially engaged practices that emphasize care and community and autobiography. Perhaps the more radical end of stand-up comedy, and people like a duo in the UK called Noble and Silver, who won a big comedy award in Edinburgh, again back in the 90s or the early 2000s, who did a kind of anarchic brand of interactive comedy that was very influential. And Kim Noble sort of was certainly part of Forest Fringe in later years. And then the work of collectives like Forced Entertainment and Shunt, that had a kind of spiky, ironic, trash aesthetic, I suppose you could say, although I don't know if any of them would actually agree with that description. But it was work that seemed to have an innate understanding of the way we consume popular culture, or the way we were about to start consuming popular culture, which is fast and indiscriminately in bloodshot late night binges. This scene that was not just about the work and the form of the work, it was also about the places where that work was made or presented. A venue called Battersea Art Centre in London, which some of you might be familiar with. Shunt, the collective that I mentioned just briefly, they just a second ago, they had an incredible venue in a series of underground catacombs in London Bridge during the sort of the 2000s. That was a real hub and a real kind of electric place. And then so maybe later on, and particularly for the story of this book, Forest Fringe in Edinburgh, which Francisco mentioned, which was the venue that I co-directed for a number of years with my colleagues Deborah Pearson and Ira Brand, both of whom feature in the book, perhaps understandably. And Forest Fringe, I think, was important because it's where a lot of these trends seemed to kind of coalesce into a recognizable community of artists, not least because the economics of Edinburgh meant that artists often all had to share a sort of single flat together. But by the end of the sort of 2010s, there was definitely a sense that there's a scene. But of course, that continued to change and grow over the course of the next decade. Growing, I think, perhaps more interested in the idea of explicit questions of politics and social justice, perhaps more sophisticated in its use of form, and perhaps in some ways also closer to mainstream text-based theatre establishment in the UK, in part because that mainstream establishment was so curious about this work, and a lot of those artists ended up going on and making things within more mainstream theatres in the UK. Primarily, this scene was under-documented and under-analysed for those reasons, that it was this kind of punky DIY alternative that existed by and large in smaller spaces, in warehouses, in unconventional spaces, and for a younger audience. And I think that fact that the work was sort of under-documented and under-analysed was one of the motivating factors behind the creation of the book. We wanted to try and address that in some way. I think one of the interesting things about the idea of Maddy and I as chroniclers of this scene is that we both, I think it would be fair to say, arrived to it fairly late-ish, or were not present from the very beginning, if there is such a thing as a beginning. Maddy began primarily as a music journalist. I think you would agree with that, for The Guardian and other people. A cultural journalist, cultural critic maybe, and kind of came into theatre and particularly this community with like the force of 1,000 suns, and has sort of been a vital part of it ever since, doing all sorts of things, writing about work incredibly passionately, hosting events, theatre clubs, working as a sort of dramaturg of sorts as well. So, you know, has sort of become completely embedded as a writer and as a kind of cultural linchpin of that community. And I also first encountered a lot of this work when artists had already been around for a few years as a very young press officer at Battersea Arts Centre, and was and Forest Fringe was originally started by my friend Debbie and then myself when we were still very, very young and still kind of learning what this scene was and who these people were. And we used to be young once. We cannot, so I think that this is interesting. Maybe Maddy will touch on this more, but we cannot make any particular claim to authority, which is something that I think we talked about a lot or thought about a lot in the making of this book. Although perhaps inevitably, I've written here, the cultural weight that comes with a book about a scene that is otherwise so poorly documented imposed a level of authority on us that we bristled with, but grudgingly acknowledged. So the book itself came about because in 2018, I sent Maddy an email that started, "Hey dude, how you doing? Blah, blah, blah. I was just idly toying with an idea and thought it would be a fun thing to do with you. So I thought I'd email you and see what you think. I was wondering about proposing to Oberon, who is a publisher in the UK, to put together a kind of defiantly subjective, willfully unexhaustive collection of texts or essays or whatever you want to call them about all the artists that I love and love writing about. Perhaps it would be called something like a partial encyclopedia of live performance or something. Basically a space to gather bits of writing that are specifically about one artist or even one show into something more substantial, a kind of ephemeral cross-section of people doing stuff. And then I thought it would be so much nicer and broader brackets and more likely to happen if that was a collaboration. And so obviously I thought immediately of you and how often I feel the things we write about the artists we know might complement one another and form a really nice compendium. Anyway, that was my thought. Maybe it's not a good one, or perhaps you're way too busy. And as Maddy always does, she responded with remarkable enthusiasm. She mentioned a book by the former artistic director of the Globe called Dominic Dromgoole that he wrote called The Full Room, in which each chapter was about a different playwright of his era. And that was kind of our blueprint, that we would do something similar. So we then compiled a list of people we wanted to write about. We tried very hard not to think about being comprehensive. We tried very hard to focus on the artists we loved or moments of performances that had stayed with us, to foreground that subjectivity, or with artists that might exemplify something we cared about or were interested in. As I said, we tried to embed subjectivity in our choices as a way of making ourselves seem more vulnerable and less authoritative. The project actually began, it's nice that it sort of began via this email, because then in the actual writing of the project, it also began as an email mailing, a mail out that we, in the years when you were still allowed to do this before GDPR, just arbitrarily subscribed a bunch of our friends to. And we used that mail out as a way of keeping the discipline of writing going. So each month, one or other of us would be responsible for writing an essay. And so each month, or each fortnight, I can't remember now, each fortnight, a new mail out would go out with a new essay about a different artist. And not only was that a useful way for Maddy and I to kind of think through the process of what we were writing, but it also became a useful way to think through that process with the artists that we were writing about. And Maddy may talk about how that feedback informed our writing a bit later on. Then once we'd sort of felt confident with what we were doing, we approached a publisher, and once we had a publisher on board, we sort of began to write privately. So at least some of the book would be a surprise to people purchasing it. As we were writing, I think that what we were doing together was trying to reach out towards the edges of the scene that we felt ourselves to be in the middle of. So some of the chapters, like the chapter on forced entertainment that I will read an excerpt from later, kind of reached back in time to sort of think about the origins of the scene. Others reached sort of forward to artists that were sort of very brand new at the point that we were writing about them. And we were also kind of reaching outwards. Where are the limits where this thing that we think ourselves to be a part of ends and something separate to us begins? So it was a kind of exploratory process, finding the edges, or finding what felt to us like the edges of this universe. As we wrote, it became apparent that in part what we were describing was the way in which the politics, the economics, and the aesthetics of this alternative scene had been transformed by the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. That moment seemed to mark a shift in a lot of ways. And for that reason, we began to conceive of this as the starting point of the book. Although it reached back further, that moment was the moment at which something changed and something new began. But it was really only once the book had been almost completed that the lens through which we were considering these artists completely shifted with the arrival of the pandemic. It created another point of rupture, another ellipsis. And although obviously we couldn't know what would come afterwards, and probably none of us still do know, it felt safe to say that the pandemic, and as Francisco said, it really felt like the end of something. And it was very useful to us to suddenly have these two markers in time, these two bookends, for the book to be about a kind of a resourcefulness and a community building that happened in the gap between these two kinds of disaster. It helped us really see what we were writing about for the first time. It created a pocket of time that we could study and consider, that we could weigh in our hands and hold up to the light to examine. And that's everything I'm going to say. So I will hand over to Maddy.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to speak to the idea of exchange, and I'm also going to perform the idea of exchange because I haven't pre-written this. So I've got, partly because I didn't want to have something pre-prepared that then veered off in like the opposite direction from Andy. And I wanted to be able to bring in some stuff that he'd said. It does mean that what follows might be a bit of a mess and might be darting around all over the place. I'm going to start with exchange, and two thoughts about exchange. One is that, like Andy said, I came to this from quite a long background in journalism. I was writing for The Guardian about music and also about theatre. It tended to be music reviews and theatre features, slightly weird balance. And around the time that Andy talks about the sort of our starting point of the book, that sort of 2008 era, I was quite busily not seeing theatre because I was quite busily having children and trying to bring them up. So there was a way in which I sort of stepped into this landscape trying to rediscover myself after motherhood. And I think that kind of, there's something of that in the book, not necessarily visible. the point is, though, that I was coming with kind of lots of journalism baggage that I was trying to shed, and Andy was coming as someone like performing within that landscape as well as writing about it. And I think so much of the energy of the book comes from an exchange between those two disciplines, and me like already using critical writing in creative ways, but kind of learning from Andy the ways in which you can be playful with that and create fiction within that. And I think some of my sort of slightly I don't know what the best word for it is, but that kind of like journalistic balance, or that quite kind of slightly formal writing for the Guardian on a Saturday afternoon tone kind of seeped into some of Andy's writing as well. And I really like that was one of the joys of working together, that exchange could happen. Another really early thing that Andy brought to the book was and it's why that original tiny letter was called Criticism and Love, was he'd read a very long essay. I'm going to have to check, because we do acknowledge him at the beginning, but I've forgotten. It's by Max S. Gordon about Beyonce and Jay-Z, that contained this line, criticism when done responsibly is an act of love. And we were really interested in that. We were really interested in kind of that. Maybe this is where the sort of, for me, the sort of parenting is deeply buried in it as well. Like what it means to approach writing about people's work with the responsibility of knowing that you're doing it, not necessarily in dialogue with them, but like Andy said, with them reading it and being able to feed back and being able to say kind of when you've misinterpreted something, or when your interpretation is actually your own self that you've brought to the work. One thing that we were really aware of when writing this, and it's something that we touch on, that we address quite directly in the introduction to the book, is that a lot of this work demands, some of it demands, some of it invites. There are sort of varying degrees of that, an engagement from the audience. All theatre kind of requires that engagement from the audience. Like we've all sat in really dismal fourth wall shows where everyone in the audience is kind of not, thinking about something else, and there's no sort of exchange between the stage and the auditorium, and it's just a bit ghastly. But a lot of this work is that we're writing about. I mean, some of it is literally just you and the performer in a room together. Some of it is inviting you to participate. There's a show by Greg Wohead that I'm thinking of that is asking you to help him reconstruct something. So there are all these different ways in which the fact that it's you that's there matters, and you're being invited to engage directly. And it felt really important for the writing to do that. That it felt as though a responsible criticism to this work would recognize that's the subjectivity, the invitation, and the ways in which the writing was a kind of performance back. And that's something that I'd been thinking about for quite a long time before Andy approached me as well. The ways in which there's a beautiful line that Theron Schmidt and Mary Patterson, and Mary's another collaborator, that someone I work with a lot and who's very important to me. There's a beautiful line that they have, that how we talk about the work is also the work, how we whisper about the work is also the work. So there is a way in which we at once wanted to recognize that that writing about the work is its own kind of performance, and so part of the responsibility is to then not kind of draw attention to ourselves. The attention still has to be on the work that we're writing about, but at the same time, something we were really strenuously resisting was this kind of the kind of criticism that I'd practiced within journalism of the objective gaze, recognizing that that gaze is never objective, it's always subjective, and that most of the people who've occupied that gaze, who write about theatre over the course of the 20th century, were white men. Like, it's a power construct, and we were quite consciously trying to dismantle that power construct. So we were also thinking about writing as political action, and so when we came to sort of sequencing the work, it was a deliberate choice to start with an essay about Rachel Young, who's a Black female performer, with me talking very explicitly about my white gaze and what it means to bring the white gaze into a room where a Black female performer is talking about the discrimination that Black women experience in institutionally racist societies. So so we worked a lot understanding that that the writing has a kind of responsibility to be political, to address the politics that the artists were also working with. And Andy already talked about that kind of slippage of at once wanting to resist holding a position of authority in relation to the work, but also having to acknowledge that authority, because not acknowledging it would be a lie, really, and it would be kind of upholding, replicating all of the hierarchies that we wanted to resist within the book. One of the ways in which we enacted that resistance was that we received some really interesting and useful, a really interesting, useful peer review that was anonymous. And among the comments was that the sequencing of the chapters meant that the reader had to kind of work to join the dots between or connect across different chapters, and he wondered why, for instance, we didn't have a section that was dedicated to that kind of held all of the Black performers, for instance. And that's exactly what we were trying to resist. We're trying to resist that kind of easy categorization, and we were trying to invite people to connect across themes and across ideas and across politics, because that's the work that and work's a funny word to use for it. It's also a pleasure. It's what keeps you in the landscape and keeps you moving around the landscape, is that the joy of making those connections. I mean, I could probably talk for like another 48 hours, so I might just leave introductory remarks at that, and move on to a first reading. This is a chapter that I wrote. I did think a couple of days ago it might have been quite funny for me and Andy to swap chapters, and I partly think that because one of my favourite performances I've ever seen was Andy Field and Chris Thorpe on stage reading each other's texts, and there was just something delightful about hearing each other's. They have quite distinctive written voices, but yeah. But I think if I had challenged Andy to read the chapter I'm about to read, he might have found a way to punch me down the telephone. I definitely received him suggesting this as a challenge as well. It's a chapter about two really interesting multidisciplinary artists in the UK, Alexandrina Hemsley and Jamila Johnson Small. It's a mark of how multidisciplinary they are, that Jamila currently has a work on at one of the Tate galleries in the UK, and Alexandrina recently was an editor with Disability Arts, curating some extraordinarily important and interesting writing. They, I talk about this within the text as well. They choreograph, they dance, they write, they make films. They have a really kind of resistant practice, I guess. They're people who resist categorization, and when writing this, I found myself thinking very obsessively about a particular moment in a particular work. And so the essay is as much as anything a kind of fight between myself and that single scene, and what it means to kind of represent such a wide body of work from just one scene. So I'm going to try and read this now. I did do a run through, but who knows what will happen now. So, Alexandrina Hemsley and Jamila Johnson Small. Too complex to contain in a single image, too complex to reduce to one motion, one scene, marking or not marking the difference between. In the publicity for Voodoo, Jamila Johnson Small and Alexandrina Hemsley talk about the responsibility of being a single subject who is also a symbol of many long persecuted people. Pulling away, but the tension is. Their collaboration is multiple, contains multitudes. They inhabit and insist on multiplicity, on being dancers who also write, who also make film, who also exhibit, who also dance, like there's no difference between the stage and the nightclub and the house party. Dance like there's no difference. Multiple differences coded into skin and limb, the body's curves and openings. Multitudes too complex to contain in a single image. Just like there wasn't one version of Voodoo, that work always in flux. Each of the 3 different versions I saw an attempt at reconfiguring the power dynamic between performer, black, performer, mixed race, and audience, mostly white. A power dynamic caught in a fishing net strung above the stage, scattered with tiny bones, lost lives. And the scroll of dates and events detailing racism and persecution of Black people, hours and months and decades and centuries of it. Feeding into black holes, Alexandrina's collaboration with Seki Chimatengwende, the way it played on the words dark matter, dark, this matter, this skin or its perception. What darkness does matter? What matters? It matters when Alexandrina is groped by someone invited only to apply paint to her body in O. It matters when a reviewer, white, male, of swagger, describes performer Kay Hyatt as a hefty, pugnacious lesbian, and Alexandrina needs to email him patiently once, twice, to explain that words carry stereotypes, carry assumptions, carry offense. It matters too when he listens and asks his editor to switch the word lesbian for performer. It matters when Alexandrina begins to question the word holistic and finds it was coined by a white man who condoned segregation. It matters when just one image is isolated as representative symbol from a body of work constantly shifting between movement, text, dance, image, choreography, collaborators' minds. Matter, dark matter, shifting minds. We mind that society is like this, that culture is like this, that even the small world of performance we move in is like this. We mind the use of we. We mind, we read, we absorb, we think, and we laugh. Laugh in O as lithe limbs writhe to the pulse of zebra cats as I'm a read, peeling back the rug to a pile of books. I see feminist classics. I see Simone de Beauvoir. And in writing this, the wry read of self by no name. Come here with your objectifying eyes. You want to see what her pussy been doing. And this is all too complex to contain in a single image. And yet this image, searing. Jamila, performing as last year's interesting Negro, is trying to move forward. Her arms are moving, dance. Her legs are moving, forward, dance. Her mind is moving, but her body is tethered by a thick elastic rope, and no matter how far she tries to move forward, leaning into the, it holds her back. The rope holds her back. The rope and everything it represents holds her back. And the tension is visible. Tension in the rope, taut, tight, holding. Tension in her body, arms, legs, her body slanting forward with the energy of trying to move, straining to move, but she can't. Locked in, locked by, just for a moment. No way to slip from, the grip of, break this tension. Handing over to Andy.
No mic, Andy.
Can you hear me now? Okay, don't know what happened there. I'm going to read an excerpt from a chapter about the company Forced Entertainment. I'm sure that some of you may have seen work by Forced Entertainment. I won't explain too much because the piece itself is quite self-explanatory when it comes to their history. And yeah, there's nothing really else to say about this other than I suppose it is an engagement with the subjectivity of our understanding, but you'll see. So, and this isn't the whole chapter, by the way. That would be way too long. Part 1. I have seen some forced entertainment shows. Between 2007 and 2013, I saw every show that the theatre company Forced Entertainment made. In studio theatres and town halls, and even via live stream, I watched everything that I could. I have seen more shows by Forced Entertainment than I have the shows of any other single company. Part 2. A list of all the Forced Entertainment shows I haven't seen. Jessica in the Room of Lights, 1984. Jessica in the Room of Lights was first performed in Sheffield on December the 14th, 1984. I was living in Stockport at the time, only about an hour away. I was 352 days old. In the show, disparate elements combine in ways that are new and unexpected. Tape recorders crackle. John Avery's soundscapes fizz and hum, and bare light bulbs illuminate the room with an abrasive lack of theatricality. All of this is happening in a faded pre-digital monochrome, a show assembled from the shaky snapshots and blurred impressions. My hair is black, but it won't stay that way. 200% and Bloody Thirsty, 1987. In the photograph, 3 performers lie semi-naked on a bed surrounded by mountains of discarded clothes, as if some orgy of metamorphosis has just reached its sweaty conclusion, a feverish scramble through a rogues gallery of hastily sketched but achingly familiar characters. The 3 performers look young and somewhat intimidating, sharing the trace of menace implicit in their company's name. In the background, a red neon sign reads 200% and Bloody Thirsty, which I think makes sense because if I had come up with a title that good, I too would suspend it above the stage in large illuminated letters. Emmanuel Enchanted, 1992. More costumes and more characters, their descriptions now drawn on hand-painted cardboard signs. These characters are by turns familiar and strange, comic and heartbreakingly sad, conjuring in their multitude a restless and dizzyingly expansive version of the world, a portrait of a time and a place that is less like the bounded world of the theatre and more like the experience of too many bloodshot hours skipping aimlessly through late-night television in insomniac darkness. These characters are what I associate most closely with these early, unexperienced years of forced entertainment, and the thing I have stolen most flagrantly and unintentionally from them, populating an early show of mine about disaster movies with an uncannily similar collage of imagined people, each with their name neatly printed on an accompanying white index card. A man walking a dog, poor Sharon, a horny priest, Geronimo, a sexist van driver, a woman picking gum out of her hair, a man trying to extricate himself from a torrid affair, Kevin looking for his keys, the world's last Neil Diamond fan, a woman who can barely remember her own name, an aspiring artist caught accidentally in an obvious act of plagiarism. Club of No Regrets, 1993. It is the summer of 1993. My family and I are at Universal Studios, Florida, and it is the most enchanting place I have ever been. The air is thick and popcorn sweet. I am losing myself in a phantasmagoria of sentimental Hollywood glamour. A vast New York skyline painted in steel grays, a carbon fiber Amity Island shark hanging jaws first from a wooden gibbet, Marilyn Monroe and the Blues Brothers smiling and waving and signing autographs. Even the cobbles of a San Francisco street amaze me. It is like slipping temporarily into a world I don't belong to, and yet, of course, at the same time, it isn't. It is deliberately unreal, and that is part of the allure, the appealing flatness of that New York skyline, the way the cobbles abruptly end, replaced by regulation theme park asphalt. It thrills me in the same way as a half-finished painting or learning how a magic trick is done. Even now, it is hard to know whether I am more in love with the impossibly romantic make-believe American cinema imagines or the fantasy-making apparatus that produces it. Speak Bitterness, 1994. The stage is a long desk, long enough for 7 or 8 people to be sat behind it as if arranged for a press conference. And along the top of the desk are hundreds of sheets of paper. So much paper, so many words, as there so often are in forced entertainment's work. No end and no beginning, just seemingly infinite variations on simple linguistic constructions, a litany of confessions, a long list of questions, thousands of in the futures or once upon a times. I'm reminded of Alan Caprow writing about the legacy of Jackson Pollock, of how his painting refused to acknowledge the presence or meaning of an edge, instead seeming to extend outwards in all directions well beyond the limits of the visible canvas. The 4 sides of the painting are thus an abrupt leaving off of the activity, which our imaginations continue outward indefinitely, as though refusing to accept the artificiality of ending. More than once, I have been in a forced entertainment show that I believed might never end. Any semblance of a satisfying dramatic arc bulldozed aside by a kind of relentless televisual logic, a theatrical world as endless and repetitive, as vast and comic and occasionally unbearable as life itself. Nights in This City, 1995. We are driving through a city at night. It might be Sheffield in 1995, but it also might be London in 2010. This could be a forced entertainment show or an idea of one. Either way, it is not clear who is driving or where you are going. Outside, the streets unfold like some interminable sentence, a never-ending story made of glass lobbies, shuttered-off licenses, and late-night takeaways. But from in here, it appears too quiet and too peaceful to be entirely real. This quality of theme park estrangement is heightened by the voices in your ear, deadpan, inscrutable, describing a place that seems at once wildly imaginary and tediously real. They sound drunk, or maybe just confused, yelling into the amber-lit drizzle of the disinterested city, asking for something it cannot give them. You pass the occasional person out on the street, some of whom seem to turn slowly to meet your gaze as you drift by. They all look uncannily perfect, like they are moving in quotation marks. The city shivers as if even exposure to these trace amounts of unreality can cause it to unmake and remake itself. It is still not clear whose show this is, what city you're in, or even what year it is. But isn't that the definition of liveness, asks Tim, when guides twitch nervously or appear to be lost, when safe passage back to the everyday is no longer assured. Showtime, 1996. The word deadpan first appeared in print in the New York Times in 1928, used to refer to Buster Keaton, although their casual deployment of the term would seem to imply that it was already common parlance by this point. Maybe you already know this, but pan used to be theatrical slang for your face. Hence, a dead pan was a face seemingly without life or feeling, expressionless, impassive. It is quite literally a face haunted by death, a face with the skull already showing through, like the hapless skeletons that have appeared in forced entertainment's work on more than one occasion. It is a reminder, as if we needed one, of how humor always glimmers with death, or perhaps death glimmers with laughter. A shirtless man holding tin spaghetti innards to his abdomen, slowly expiring over the course of about an hour. Pleasure, 1997. I am closing my eyes and listening to forced entertainment in my head, that unmistakable shared cadence, deadpan, opaque, themselves and not themselves, at once invested in the words they are saying and the stories they are telling, but also always aware of the disposability of those words and their artifice, always ready in a moment to demolish and discard the fictions that they have patiently constructed, like a cat suddenly breaking in half the mouse it has spent the last hour playing with. The pleasure of creation and the pleasure of destruction. Storytelling for the nuclear age. And that's the end of that.
Thank you, Andy and Maddy. That was lovely. I was thinking about what you said earlier about how the book started, and I was also being reminded of how we now, just when we read a play in a book, we don't know how that text emerged, how it came about, and so maybe it's a Greek tragedy, or maybe it's something by Shakespeare, or maybe it's something by Chris Thorpe, and they all look the same. They're all printed in a book in black and white, and I was thinking how interesting it is when you know and how this specific collection of texts emerged. And I remember when Andy first told me about this book, that you were planning to publish it, I was already subscribing to the newsletter, to Criticism and Love. And I think at the same time we were discussing this podcast we both enjoyed, called The Anthropocene Reviewed, by an American novelist called John Green, and it's also now a book. The podcast, which was a collection of essays, has been also turned into a book. And I think it's really interesting that these forms, the email newsletter and the podcast, are now ways of writing. So after maybe after the blog, or as a way of running away from Facebook and Twitter, you're finding these ways of writing that are in a way, I think what they share perhaps is this intimacy. I think what the newsletter had was every 2 weeks you knew you would, on a Monday, I think, you knew you would get this piece of writing, and it felt like it was for you specifically. So it's not really a question. It's just asking you to maybe talk a little bit more about how that influenced the way you wrote and you write.
I think there's something really beautiful about how you describe that intimacy, because in some ways it was exactly as Andy says. The suggestion, I think it was me who suggested using tiny letter, and it was a really just a practical solution to both of us having a lot of always juggling a lot of different things, and knowing that unless we set this work within some kind of defined framework, and usually it's money that defines this, usually when you're working as a freelancer, it's the work that you're being paid for, or the work that other people are dependent upon. That's the work that gets prioritized. So especially at the beginning, when it was just us writing, we had to kind of create a structure that meant we would actually do the work. And then so then there's something, and this is what I find so beautiful about what you've just described about being a recipient of it, is that what begins as sort of pragmatism becomes something else, becomes and so much of I won't speak for Andy here, but I think it probably is true for both of us. So much of what preoccupies us is how can we resist the market logics of that kind of reach into everything, and this was one way of doing that, was by kind of creating an online community that wasn't defined by money, and it was only defined by time in ways that we defined for ourselves. So yeah, it's beautiful that intimacy is then the product of that's what's generated. And then I suppose that, just again to kind of always be picking up on those attempts to slip away from authority. A very funny email exchange that Andy and I had towards when the book was about to be published. Andy emailed me and said, "Have you done anything about promotion?" And I did the equivalent on email of laughing in his face and saying, "Do you know who I am?" Because I think that it's intimacy and community that we're interested in, and not kind of marketizing. On the other hand, like, here is a product, and that is also now one of the outcomes. So there's something very odd in that balance.
I think I'm still organizing ideas, but I was thinking of I think in both of your readings there is this there are a lot of things. At a certain moment Andy is saying so many words, you're saying multitudes, so it's really interesting as a chronicle, I don't know, like as a chronicles, como é que é? Cronista, Francisco.
Yeah, chronicler. Yeah. Chronicler.
As a chronicler of this scene or of this time, which is a very interesting way of putting it. Suddenly what tipo, o que é que me dão a ver? Como é que eu digo isto? What do you make me see now? And this is really interesting because you make me see multitudes of things. Then at a certain moment, Andy is talking about this relentless television logic, which is also really interesting. I think at a certain moment I was, in another moment, I think Andy was writing about something that at a certain moment you don't know which show was. I was reading in Portuguese, so I was kind of, you don't know which show is this about or whose show you're seeing. So and I was trying to relate those words with the book itself. So, and with the scene itself that you give me to see. So I don't know if you can say something about these multitudes and these so many words that in the end constitute this book and this period of time. And
yeah,
maybe it's too vague. I can make a more.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. Yeah, I think, I mean, it partly comes back to Francisco's question for me about the form that this writing originally took. In that I think that the seeming inconsequentiality of a mail out to a bunch of friends and colleagues encouraged a certain amount of playfulness and performativity in the writing, that actually we were happy to be unreliable chroniclers, and in fact that became more and more important as it went on, as a way of, as I mentioned, foregrounding a subjectivity that refuses the idea that this is the canonical, definitive encapsulation of this era. There could, with work that is so ephemeral and ambiguous and anarchic, there can be no definitive version of it, because everyone brings themselves to that work in ways that are both literal and figurative. So all we could do was use all these words to build these kind of vast sculptures out of words that attempted to honor the work through language. And I do think that if we'd have sat down with a blank Word document and attempted to write a book from the very beginning, we might have felt a bit more intimidated into being a bit more conservative in our approach. But the fact that it was a mail out made us encouraged us to kind of egg each other on to come up with more outlandish forms and more ways of honoring these outlandish artists that we love so much.
I think I have a very concrete question, which is there are no titles. I mean, it's the artist's names, and then you talk about whatever. So I think this is not. It's really interesting as a structure that you read this piece of text about this name. I don't know some of the names, so it's kind of, sometimes I'm reading this about this name, and then I got then you have further reading of, and this is a really interesting way of. I mean, how did you arrive to this, and also in the book, but also in the newsletter, how which were your rules? What was your writing discipline? I mean, you were writing about performances, art. How come did you never slip away to talking, I don't know, other things, or I don't know.
I mean, I think we do talk about other things, like there's lots of sort of quoting from other writers, and we're both kind of very influenced by John Berger, who I'm just reading a new or newish biography of Berger at the moment that talks about how art and politics were always intertwined in his work, and how he also worked across disciplines, and there's a bit in the introduction where we talk about using a quote from John Berger, like a kind of criticism that aspires to the condition of poetry. What we're quoting from there is Berger talking about. I'm going to misquote him hopelessly now, but he's talking about the difference between a kind of storytelling that is sort of quite that is engaged with sort of power, really. And whereas this work that aspires to the condition of poetry is really on the side of the sort of battle wounded, and is in the space of care. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that speaking to this point that you raised about each chapter just being the names of the artists, we keep coming back to this sort of not authority, or the thing that Andy just said about recognizing our own unreliability. And like, actually, I feel like literally physical discomfort at being unreliable. And one of the most kind of dynamic and important exchanges that happened was between me and Greg Wohead, who read the first published version of the chapter about him, and spoke on social media about how the fact that that we speak to each other outside of the shows, that we know people in common, means that I probably know more about him than critics with more distance, and means that I might bring a much more personal interpretation. And actually through that dialogue, we realized that the personal interpretation I was making of his work was so much about my own life and where I was at the moments of watching his work. So sorry, that's traveled quite far from this idea of unreliability, but what we were really trying to do was say, this is not a definitive account of each of these artists. It's a snapshot or a series of snapshots. And one thing that we consistently adhered to was having the permission to not have to write about every single work that a company had made, not least, or an artist had made, not least because we might not have seen all of them. It then made it quite hard, speaking personally, if I had seen all of the work, to then make choices. So the choices about what to write about were always initially kind of driven by what you'd actually seen, and then from that, what was the story, or rather, what was the sort of poetic encounter that you might want to describe, rather than trying to do a kind of Wikipedia page of each artist. That sort of ticked off all of the works.
I think as well, like I liked sort of setting up the formal conceit of each chapter being about a different artist, and then seeing how far you could push that. So, like Maddy said, one of the chapters I wrote about a choreographer called Dan Cannon was like 2,000 words on a single gesture from his show, or the chapter that is purportedly about a company called Deer Park mentions them very briefly in a chapter that is actually also about a lot of other things. It's about my first encounter with live art. It's about a particular higher learning college that they attended that has been very influential in the UK. And it's about the sort of ephemerality of certain performance companies and how, so it was sort of, we were trying to push that to create a structure and then see how far we could kind of push it.
And I think, just to add one more little thing, I think that certainly something I've been thinking about through the theatre club work that was mentioned in the introduction is how so theatre club is just you've been hosting them as well, and it's just an open space that anyone can come to. And what you very quickly realize in that setting, where the questions that you have about the show you just ask of other audience members, is that everyone is watching through the lens of their entire lives up until that moment, basically, and so there was a way in which it was only possible to be truthful about our experience of watching or engaging in this work by also acknowledging all of that kind of like usually hidden baggage that is generally kept out of theatre criticism, but that is present, and that might have affected how you watch this, like Andy said, you know, all of this work is ephemeral. It's all kind of like a moment in time. And had you seen something 2 weeks later or in a different venue in a different city, you might have experienced it totally differently. So it was also trying to capture some of that.
Yeah, I was thinking several things, but I was in another talk this weekend, also on Zoom, but also in real life, so both at the same time. And it's this ongoing series of talks in another city in Portugal, in Viseu, called The Beginnings of a Show. And they invite different people to talk about how shows begin. And so it's really interesting. And I was thinking about literally about show beginnings, and about, for instance, about how GATS, by Elevator Repair Service, starts, and how Philippe Ken's La Mélancolie des Dragons starts, and how Lucy McCormick's Triple Threat starts. And they all start with some sort of malfunction, something breaking down. So in GATS, the computer doesn't work, and then he finds the book, the novel that he starts reading from. And then La Mélancolie, it's the car that breaks down, and it's they're waiting a week until the right equipment arrives, so they might as well show their friend the amusement park that they're working on. And in Triple Threat, it's the microphone that doesn't work because it's not really a microphone; it's a dildo. And so it's this malfunction, this failure that is then what makes the show begin, and the performance start, as a kind of an alternative to the capitalistic efficacy of stuff. And I was thinking that but the way you use email is the I think the nightmare of our lives. It's so it's the thing that when it arrives, it's like it used to be maybe bills in your mail, but now it's emails that arrive and bring usually so more obligations, or just the fact that you need to reply is kind of a threat over your head. And that I think it's really interesting that you found this gap in the system. Not just you, but that the email newsletter is it can be so it's this way of fighting the system from within. So that in a sense, and also the what you said about the exchange with Greg Wohead, the fact that this initial sharing of the writing via email is in a way a kind of it has a kind of liveness to it that a book doesn't have. So because it's there's more delay between the writing and the reading, and so I was wondering if there was more of that liveness effect in the sharing of it that then found its way into the actual book, so that between the versions that you published first and what you then wrote, and how that had an impact on the finished book, and if the book already has had any influence on your further endeavors.
It's really, I think about this quite a lot, how each of the essays, certainly of mine, and I only say that just because I'm like Andy and I sort of, although it was a very sort of connected process, it was also quite a separate process. It was the exchange was we were constantly sharing, but we were also working alone quite a lot. So I don't know how many drafts he went through, but I know that that the essays of mine that went on to Tiny Letter were mostly kind of went through quite a lot of rewriting before they were published, but then didn't necessarily get a lot of rewriting between that and the book. But there's also a dividing line, which is that the Tiny Letter lasted for just over 20. We did just over 20, and then essays there, and then we did just about around 20 privately.
Yeah.
And that was really odd. It was really odd taking away that liveness. It was really odd just being each other's readers in that time. And the other thing that is odd is how little rewriting happened once it got to the stage of gathering it together. I mean, especially for me, I was kind of writing right up until the last minute. I finished the chapter on. It's not in chronological order of writing. It's not in any kind of order that can be categorized in that way. The last chapter that I finished for it was on uninvited guests, and that was just before. I think I talk about this within the chapter, that this was an additional bit that I wrote after we'd submitted the manuscript. But I was writing right up until the moment that the theatres closed. There was, I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm sort of dancing around here, but I think it's something to do with the ways in which the text became fixed. And I there's still a part of me that feels slightly uncertain about that, I think, and feels slightly uncertain about them being in a book. Like it's complete magic, you know, it's kind of genuinely life's ambition achieved, that the book exists and is on the bookshelf and all the rest of it. And at the same time, there's this ambivalence that it exists, where everything that is written about within it just sits within memory. And there is something about the Tiny Letter form that allowed for some more movement around that, which is exactly what you were just saying. And I think this is what I'm sort of circling around, is that I'm not sure how I feel about all this, even now. You know, there was something about stopping the Tiny Letter that was a little bit painful. I'm going to hand over to Andy in case he's got anything to add.
I don't know if I do. I suppose the thing about the Tiny Letter was that, like, an email implies impermanence in a way that a book implies the opposite. And that I'm sure that informed the writing in ways. I mean, I also have to admit that, you know, as you can tell from that email, the intention always was for it to become a book at some stage. So it would be a rewriting of the truth to say that it was purely an altruistic act of artistic dialogue that magically became a book through its undoubted success. I think that there was a trajectory, a plan for it. I'm writing another book at the moment, and I am finding it much harder to because every word appears to have much more gravity, I think, because it's not just about to be sort of thrown onto an email and sent out to people. Even if it's just the possibility of the suggestion of impermanence is quite freeing, I think.
I think I have two, not question, but two comments. One has to do with this periodization, the fact that Andy was saying that that suddenly during the pandemics you could look at this period at a distance. I think I felt for a while I was working on the 1980s in Portugal, which is when Portugal enters the European Union, and it's a period of major changes. And at a certain moment, it seemed really obvious that we could look at this moment because we were no longer in it. I mean, we don't have this optimism and that you could see even in the cultural scene when you looked at it. So in one way, you can now. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, some pessimistic people would say everything was wrong, but there was not a general tone of pessimism. And so I think that recently we can historicize the 80s as we can historicize the 20th century. We can look and say we are not in the 20th, but I didn't thought of it concerning such a recent period. So one of my questions would be if you can define why this distance? Why is it possible? What is it? What is it there is there that it's not here any longer? So how much? So this is one question. Another question, I think it had to do with in my previous comment. I think I wasn't clear, but in some ways, I think the way you approach writing and performance has to do with all this thing of performance studies. This thing of writing about the performance is also the performance, but at certain moment. Often in performance studies, suddenly you turn the gaze towards what is not performance. You turn the gaze towards the world. So when I was concerning the discipline of your writing, I had to do it like with keeping up with performance, with the performing scene, I mean, of course, to talk about everything else. But I think that this discipline of it's. I was thinking about how complicated it would be to do something as your tiny letter here. And I think it could be this, that it could turn away your gaze towards a lot of other things. So first, the first question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think as perhaps I tried to sort of allude to earlier on, I mean, you're absolutely right. It would be preposterous to assume that you can think of anything so recent as a sort of definitive era, but I think that.
But maybe you can actually. That's
yeah. I mean, I suppose that the thing was that for us, you know, as I said, the notion of a scene is so open-ended, right? That there are artists that we describe in this book who are, who began making work before other people in the book were even born. So you're not talking about a discrete scene. You're talking about a kind of continuum and a kind of a cultural space that's in a constant process of flux, with people moving in and out of like a stream. If you want to think of it like that, it's a stream, an artistic stream, and maybe it's an upstream bit of that, right? But those markers that we chose, I suppose they are less like, although I kind of neatly metaphorically described it as being a discrete era, that it's more like, you know, they provide these two kinks in the stream that sort of redirect the energy of that stream in a sort of temporary way. And what we were attempting to do was analyze that moment of redirection and its impact. Like, we knew before the pandemic happened, a lot of things were kind of coalescing around this moment of the financial crisis, because I think you could see a change in the economic circumstances of artists working in the UK. You could see a change in the economic circumstances of venues, which meant a lot of venues disappearing, which meant a different category of venue rising up in its place, places that were more precarious, that were less conventional, beautifully maintained spaces, and more like empty, dusty warehouses with a few lights. And so you also saw a change in, maybe fewer companies with larger numbers of people, like forced entertainment, and maybe more duos and maybe work on a smaller scale. This is one of the things when Francisco and I were discussing many years ago, bringing Forest Fringe artists to Culture Jest. One of the challenges that we faced was that the work being made was on a smaller scale. It doesn't fit in these big spaces, which is why we chose to conceive of a micro festival in which we converted this big cultural center into like a festival space with things happening in the lobby and things happening in the car park downstairs. So what we were seeing were these trends that didn't represent a fundamental break from what had come before, but maybe just a temporary redirecting. And so I think that what we could say with confidence about the pandemic, even if we didn't know what the outcome of that would be, we could say with some confidence that stream was redirected again. And therefore, that gave us the opportunity to kind of analyze this particular bend in the river and consider what happened there, what was able to grow there.
Okay, I guess I understand, of course. So actually, I had that idea when I was listening to you, that you ended up organizing the book already in pandemic, right?
Yeah, I think that we had to submit like a final draft to the publishers, like in, just as the pandemic was beginning, didn't we, Maddy?
I think it was late spring or early summer 2020.
Yeah. And then the book was finally published in like February 2021. So we had time for some revisions. So we slightly revised the introduction and things like that. But yeah.
But the other thing, that we realized as well, though, is that it wasn't obviously no one knew the pandemic was coming. So at the time of writing that, it wasn't, I'm not sure how conscious it was that we were writing about something that had any kind of boundaries around it. And part of the work was Andy described it as kind of mapping a terrain, but it's a terrain that's kind of constantly moving, and also like mapping from memory. This was a thing that I was thinking about when I was talking about unreliability earlier. Like, memory is totally unreliable, and that's something that we really tried to speak to in the introduction as well, is kind of recognizing that that in some ways, like, it's not like we're making it all up, but it's kind of working from such insubstantial materials as memory and feeling, rather than kind of, like I said before, rather than a sort of Wikipedia of facts about these artists. And what shifted with the pandemic was that something stopped. It pushed all of us into a space where all that we had was memory. We weren't with that sort of treadmill of theatre, where theatre just keeps going, and there's another performance and another new performance, and like that whole machinery just stopped. And because we haven't quite come out of that yet, we don't know. I wonder how the book will feel once that treadmill starts up again, So there's an element of accident here, and within that accident is an awareness, and that we had a sort of weird moment around May when I added this sort of post-pandemic section to the uninvited guest chapter, and we did this bit of rethinking about the introduction, where we realized that if we tried to go back through the book with an awareness of pandemic, we would just have to start the whole thing from scratch. Like it had to just occupy that time and not attempt. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I'm not sure how, I think it was a conscious act of reflection, but I'm not sure if it was self-conscious, or maybe the other way around. Maybe I'm getting it twisted. And you had a second question, but I now can't remember.
Don't forget it. No. I think
I have more questions. Well, maybe one very simple question, which goes back to something Anna was saying in the beginning, or after your readings, which has to do with why you chose these two excerpts, these two chapters, and because Anna was I think very interestingly reading them as sort of poetics, or as containing a sort of a key to the whole book in a way, and I was just looking at the beginning of the Alexandrina and Jamila chapter. You say too complex to contain in a single image, which can be about maybe the whole book, and Andy was saying the Alan Caprow idea about Jackson Pollock, this idea of the canvas having no edges, this edgelessness, and so I was just sensing that there's a tension, and again a word from your text, Maddy, between this edgelessness and this idea of the bookends of the crisis and the pandemic, so that's one maybe quick question, and but also I was interested in this. I think this idea that I'm always reminded of, it comes from a quote by Godard about he said something like, if the movie you saw was bad, then it's your fault, because why didn't you do anything for the movie to be better? And I've always read this quote as a comment on writing about film or performance or theater, and I think that we all have this sense that this work, or this kind of work that we love, is so ephemeral and fragile, and I think writing about it the way you do, not any kind of writing, but the way you write about it, makes it better. And I've always felt this, for instance, deciding what to see in Edinburgh, or what to see, and I would read stuff by you and thinking that you actually make the shows better, and not better than they are. It actually improves the shows. You improve the shows with your writing, and I think it improves what comes afterwards. I think the shows that because the artists read you, and I think there's this kind of feeding into that I think is very important. I think we don't have. I don't think we have that in Portugal and in Lisbon, and it's something that I wish we had. So I was wondering how that if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Like there are pieces in this that began as little more than a kind of giddy sort of spontaneous song of delight that or even as like an extended thank you letter, like the piece that I wrote on Figs and Wigs, the world's greatest performance company. I watched their show in Edinburgh during whilst we were at Forest Fringe, and they were at another venue, and I just loved it so much that I just came back to Forest Fringe, and I sat in the office and I wrote as quickly as I could this like pain of appreciation and put it on my blog, because it felt like the only way that I could honor the experience I just had was by trying to, sing like a hymn to it, and then that went through a process of revision and reflection before the final version that ended up in the book. And interestingly, coming back to your last question, Francisco, I was then asked to adapt it for The Guardian when the book came out. And then, so actually, with a bit more reflection, having had the experience of the book, writing the book, I then was tweaking it one more time. But yeah, as we said, like the experience of art is subjective, I guess, but I do feel like I'm compelled in some situations to write because I want other people to know how good I think something is, or I want other people to see the thing that I love with the same sense of wonder that I do.
I have a dog in the room with me who has just been dancing around in circles and barking a lot. So I'm hoping she's going to stay calm. And also, if she doesn't, the sound doesn't go through the microphone while I try and add on a little bit. So Andy knows me well enough that he knows that while you were dishing out that like unbelievably beautiful praise of our writing, I was, if not visibly, certainly inside, like hiding under my desk, because it's just so kind and lovely to be told that your writing like makes the work better, and at the same time I'm like, no, it's not about me, and that tension is kind of constantly going on, but like Andy says, writing as a fan is and that's, I think that's what we were always doing, and again, and it goes back to that essay about Beyonce and Jay-Z, that was writing from the position of a fan, and as a fan you kind of there's something that's being fulfilled for you, there's something. It also goes back to that intimacy that you described as a recipient of the emails. And I guess that, so another tension that I constantly have, and I've used this metaphor quite a lot, is like, what does it mean to write about something that, like, an art form? Theatre is not movies, like, sure, the audience can make a film better, but actually the film is an artifact that the audience can't kind of directly engage with, and that's not true of theatre, A, and B, people work in theatre because it doesn't leave those traces, and the metaphor that I come back to a lot is, it's kind of like being a butterfly collector, writing about theatre sometimes, and you pin this beautiful thing down that had never had any intention of being pinned down, and what does that mean? And wrapped up in that is actually, Anna, I remembered the thing that you were saying in your second question that I wanted to kind of grab onto, which is that in the work that I do with Mary Patterson, one of the collaborations that we have is called Something Other, and it takes its name specifically from this Peggy Phelan notion that comes up in performance studies. And I feel like a tiny bit of a fraud as I talk about this, because I've never done any of that studying. It's just kind of what I've read, again, as someone interested, someone who's a fan, but I haven't read Unmarked. I haven't read Peggy Phelan. She's big hole in my reading, and so this is a quote that Mary brought to me, that you can't write about performance because when you do, it becomes something other. And that's why we pick those words, because we're really interested in what that something other is, and that's also why the kind of the form of the writing shifts around. It's why we picked these specific chapters to read out, because they are leaning into the something other. They are thinking about the performance that is made from performance. I've used phrase parallel performance quite a lot. I'm interested in the ways in which, as a writer about theatre, you can take the materials that the artists have been working with to make a performance and make something of your own that performs online somehow. And you know, like I said earlier, the tension is always around, like, how does that thing that you've made not replace the thing that you're writing about? But I was also thinking of there's a beautiful thing that the playwright and director David Gregg said in an interview with The Guardian a few years ago, that 50% of theatre is like what you watch, what you sit and watch on stage, and the other 50% is the echo. And I find that idea really beautiful, and also this idea that Tasso Stevens, an artist based in London, talks about a lot, of how, like, the show doesn't finish until you stop thinking about it. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to think about that in relation to what we were saying about kind of the demarcation of 2008 to 2020, you know. The pandemic ended a certain era of austerity Britain, and at the same time just kind of like exposed it much more sharply, much more acutely. So there's a kind of simultaneously the thing has ended and the thing never ends that's happening.
Sorry, someone just knocked me at my door. I think Francisco just made the question I was thinking, because now I just lost it a little bit, but it had to do with what, I mean, it's really interesting how you acknowledge the traditional critic position, which is this position of a certain authority, and then you try to dismantle it, to go around, and it's really interesting how this creates, I mean, how this forces you to, or makes you have different forms of writing and looking to performances, into, and even and I think my question had to do with what Francisco was saying, that you make performances better, but also my question was a little bit direct, like, how do artists receive what you're writing? How do they, if it changes what they're doing, how do they see your work, and all that? I think, but acknowledge it. I'm talking from a place where that kind of writing is almost non-existent, so I cannot really tell how would that contribute to performance. So,
Andy, are you going or am I going?
And I can go briefly. I mean, I think that Maddy ended up in more conversations with the artists than I did. I mean, I wonder if partly that's because I'm an artist myself, and so writing has always been like a kind of sort of existing over here from my relationship with the artists, as a peer and as a collaborator and as a occasional curator of their work. So I don't really know. So I don't really know why I answered that, because I don't know the answer to that question. Maddy probably has a better answer than I do. I suppose as an artist, from the perspective of an artist, I find it very stressful to read things that people have written about my work. It always makes this sort of like hot, sick feeling when doing it. But when and I think Maddy and I first became friends because Maddy writes with such care and such love about the artists that it does transform the way you think about your work. Maddy has written about my work in the past, and it's made me feel it's made the work better in my mind. And that's a beautiful thing, and I'm very appreciative of it. And I do think that it informs not simply the work that I make from that point onwards, but it informs the way that I think about that work. Conversely, I know an articulate negative review can completely transform the way that I think about a piece of work as well in a different way. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted this to be about a kind of love and a kind of celebration, I suppose. But a celebration that understood that celebration is not the opposite of criticality.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think I think I have a real terror of the writing that I do influencing the work that people make. And for 10 years now, I've been very, very influenced by an essay that was published by a writer in New York called Andy Horvitz on a website that he co-founded or founded himself called CultureBot, in which he talked about the 3 roles of the 21st century critic being dramaturgy, engagement, and advocacy. And he talked a lot about moving away from this idea of the critic as in judgment. And he there was another essay that he wrote about what he called critical horizontality, and about the work being the beginning of a dialogue, that the writing about it then extends the dialogue, and the dialogue just like carries on extending. And those 2 things were really pivotal for me when I encountered them 10 years ago. And also really important in mine and Andy's relationship has been a kind of like, even before we started writing the book, and like Andy says, like we were always writing a book, but something about putting it on tiny letter allowed me to trick myself into thinking that it wasn't a book, which meant that it actually got written, because I think otherwise the pressure that Andy describes sort of feeling now, it would have been too much. I've slightly lost the track of my thought now. It's trying to it's writing that tries. No, that's it. I was talking about a conversation between me and Andy about what it means for people who make work to also write about work. And Andy, part of Andy's advocacy as a 21st century critic was like consistently saying to other makers, also write, there's something distinctive that happens when a maker writes about work. So then something very interesting happened when we were writing the introduction, where Andy was sort of positioning us as outside, and I was like, we can't do that. Like he's been on the inside as a producer, as a maker. I've been working very sporadically, but nonetheless as a dramaturg since 2015. Like we are also making the work that we're writing about, even if we're not specifically writing about it in the book. I'm one of the sort of like stupid number of things that I'm juggling at the moment is a project with Battersea Arts Centre and 4 other theatres that is working with people who don't usually write about theatre and encouraging them to write and like supporting them as they write about a specific participatory show that's touring to the 4 different towns that they live in. one of the things that's been really kind of interesting and challenging in that project is trying to persuade them that they don't have to write stuff that looks like what you would read in a newspaper, that you can take more creative approaches, and that you can kind of write using your own voice rather than the adopted voice of the objective critic, and just kind of building lots of permissions around that I've spent a long time kind of having to build for myself. And it's a different kind of permission if your background's in journalism and if your background is in making performance. And again, it goes back to the exchange that I was talking about right at the beginning, and the kind of space that you make for each other, and the permissions that you feel by being in company, either sort of like me in company with Andy, or recognizing that kind of we're in company with everyone that we're writing about, even if they're not specifically replying, or they're not, you don't specifically know that they've read and are responding to what you've written. There's sort of explicit and also kind of invisible exchange happening simultaneously. And the writing work is always kind of moving between the visible and the sort of suspected but not necessarily known.
Thank you. I think it answered really a lot. Yeah, I think it's that I felt as that you were coming from that background and making that sort of critique, and in fact I didn't feel it in Andy and in this approach to find out some sort of space or something like that. But I also think it's really interesting that you start the book by placing us in a city, in a place, I mean, you literally places ourselves in these theaters which are not theaters, and that's really. I thought of a project that I remember that it existed, but I didn't quite follow up, which was by this collective with Bojana Sfejic and Anna Vojanovic, who at a certain moment I knew that they were in Madrid and they were going to map out the independent scene in Madrid. So it was, I mean, that approach, I didn't know how it ended. I think it was really like 10 years ago or something. But it's this thing of, suddenly you placed me in London, I believe, and I've never been to Edinburgh, so I was also trying to imagine Forest Fringe and a lot. So actually you placed me in a certain context, as I was talking with Francisco about that. And that's really interesting that you started by doing. I don't know, Francisco.
Well, I think I'm. Your kid was, I think, probably wanting to have dinner. I think it's a good time to stop if no one wants to say anything else. I think it was really, for me it was really great to listen to you and to hear more about how this book came about. And I would invite anyone who watches this, who's watching now, or who'll watch in the future, to find a copy of this book and to follow you online and find what else you're up to. And I hope, I'm sure we'll see more of you at TBA and in one guise or another. And I hope I'll see you live somewhere soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it. We are actually, it's a secret. We are trying to begin thinking about writing another book at some stage. So you can all join our tiny letter when we start that.
let's all do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
we can, I think, maybe stay in the Zoom while